everyone. Welcome to everyone joining us tonight. My name is Shayla Favor, and I have the honor of serving as chair of City Council's Housing Committee, and I'd like to officially call this hearing to order. We are hosting this meeting to discuss the potential pay-to-stay and third-party payment legislation. It's no secret that Columbus is facing a housing crisis, one that is only set to intensify as our population increases over the coming years. On March 16th, Columbus City Council announced a suite of policy proposals to address the impacts of the growing housing crisis. Our goal is threefold: to invest in our city through the sustainable development of new affordable housing units, preserve our current housing stock, and ensure the housing market is inclusive of all people, regardless of race or socioeconomic status. As chair of City Council's Housing Committee, I remain steadfast in prioritizing innovative and creative policies to advance tenant protections and housing rights for Columbus residents. In 2021, I championed the Housing for All legislative package, which focused on advancing fair, affordable housing strategies through a ban on source of income discrimination, making it illegal for landlords to refuse to rent to a prospective tenant based on his or her source of income, renter's choice, which provides tenants with different options to pay their security deposit, and rental receipt, requiring landlords to provide a rental receipt to tenants who pay with cash or money order, establishing an important protection for both tenants and landlords. To further protect tenants in the city of Columbus, we are now looking at pay-to-stay legislation, which would allow residents time to secure rental assistance dollars up until a court judgment, and third-party payment, which would require landlords to accept a third-party payment on behalf of a tenant if that tenant is not in breach of their rental agreement. As we shared in March when we announced Council's 2023 Housing Initiative, this plan is truly an all-hands-on-deck approach, demonstrating the seriousness Council takes the issue of housing. Each policy initiative includes a robust engagement process before we begin working on drafting legislation to ensure all community voices are part of the process. We have already had multiple meetings with stakeholders on the pay-to-stay and third-party payment legislation, and this public hearing is to garner even more dialogue and community input. This evening, we will hear from Andrew Dyer, Senior Policy Advisor in Council's Legislative Research Office, who will walk us through the pay-to-stay and third-party payment policies. Prior to his presentation, I will provide Laura Baker-Morris, Chief Counsel, and Hannah Jones, Deputy Director in the Department of Development, an opportunity to make remarks. Before we do that, I'd like to acknowledge my colleague, Councilmember Nick Bankston, who has joined us. Councilmember, do you have any remarks at this time? All right. Well, we will move forward. Chief Counsel Laura Baker-Morris.
Good evening, Chair Favor. I want to thank you for allowing me to participate in this hearing this evening. My role, as you have been aware, but for our viewing audience, has been to advise and provide legal guidance on the language that's going to be used in these two ordinances, and to offer legal opinion and research and support for the council as you are considering these matters. So I'm happy to be here and answer any questions that the council might have, or to do additional research if it's necessary. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Deputy Director Hannah Jones.
Good evening, Chair Favor, Councilmember Bankston. Thank you for the opportunity this evening. We wanted to highlight some of the work we have done in deploying emergency rental assistance funds since 2021. As you mentioned, Councilmember, in addition to tenant protections through City Code, rental assistance is a key component to that work, especially when it comes to including and preserving our communities and our neighbors. So beginning in 2021, we have distributed over $60 million in ERA 1 and ERA 2 through partnerships with 36 nonprofit providers. That has resulted in us being able to provide 11,000 households with emergency rental and utility assistance, and to remain stably housed and prevent evictions. In addition to regular rental assistance and utility assistance, we've also worked with legal aid in partnership with your office and community mediation services to provide over $1.2 million in funding for mediation services and legal representation at court for those who do get to eviction court. Moving forward, we have received $68 million in new and reallocated ERA2 funds. We are currently working on drafting legislation for presentation to City Council that will allow us to immediately get $25 million in additional rental and utility assistance on the street. Again, we will be providing partnership opportunities with our nonprofit partners who have worked with us to date in order to be sure that we are doing targeted outreach to populations that have either not successfully utilized the assistance or we have continued to identify through our work with our neighborhood folks. Excuse me. The last thing that is new about this is that we are putting out an RFP today that will focus on placing housing stabilization specialists throughout our community. So in addition to working with our nonprofit partners to do intake, we are providing them with an opportunity for us to fund people who will solely work on connecting residents with housing as they engage with that organization for whatever social service they need. For the remaining funding, we are working on a planning effort in order to strategically invest that funding. If we are able to invest 75% of our ERA 1 and 2 allocations to date, we can unlock the remaining 25% to actually be used to construct affordable housing. So we must expend all funds by September of 2025. So our goal is to meet that and to get as much resources to the community and to the tenants who need it. We're grateful for rental assistance, but we know that it has to work in partnership with tenant protections that are provided through the work of the City Council last year and this year. Happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. I will just, for those who may not be aware, this is the third straight Tuesday that City Council has hosted a public hearing. The last 2 Tuesdays was actually hosted by the Finance Committee to discuss ARPA funding, what it has looked like in the past and what our plan is in the future. I should dial that back. What the CARES Act funding, emergency rental assistance funding has looked at. Director Jones used ERA, that's what that's in reference to. And then to discuss what the plan for ARPA funding looks like in the future. And she's absolutely spot on. A large component of standing up what we're talking about tonight is to ensure that although the pandemic, for all intents and purposes, might be over or we're in a recovery period, the immediate need to ensure that residents have access to stable housing and dollars to support that housing still remains and will remain into the future. And so this is when I'll turn to my colleague because each council member is helping to lead those 12 strategies that were part of that announcement that we made back in March. One incredibly important one that helps to stand up the work that Department of Development is doing is the rental registry, which is looking proactively at what we know is coming down the pipeline, which is still the need to ensure that people have dollars to pay their rent and that our landlords are still made whole. Councilmember Bankston, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Favor. And again, I just want to commend you for your approach to this sweeping legislation. One of the pieces that our office is looking at, we're at the very beginning stages, as you said, and thinking about stakeholder engagement meetings. We'll also have hearings as well, but is looking at rental registry. One, for 2 reasons. One, to understand the inventory that we actually have in the city of Columbus. We know that currently we're not capturing all of what our inventory is, so that's really important to us. That will help, 1, strengthen the county's registry, but 2, also to assess a fee with that. And that fee really is for our small business owners, which I believe that our housing providers are, small businesses for the most part, but then also for those tenants. We know that emergency rental assistance is going to sunset at some point. We won't be able to keep up with the demand or precedented amount of funding that we have now, but we have to have some mechanism in place that gives us the revenue to go back to help tenants, but also to keep our small businesses solvent while also keeping folks stably housed in their home. As you know, folks missing their rent or falling behind on their rent is not simply because they don't want to pay their rent. Life happens to folks, and sometimes it's between fixing that car so you can get to your job, sometimes your second job, or paying your rent. And so I think through these types of protections to ensure that our landlords are willing and able to take that funding is only going to help our community as a whole. And so this mechanism is really important to me, and I think will only lead to the success of our rental registry and what we're trying to do with those newfound revenues.
Thank you, Council Member. We're also joined by another amazing partner from the City Attorney's Office, Assistant City Attorney Tiara Ross. She's in our Environmental Zone Division. Ms. Ross, did you have any remarks this evening?
Actually do not. I think Laura can take care of it, but I will just echo Councilmember Bankston's comment with regard to rental registry and its importance. The backside to that is just making sure that our tenants know who to reach out to when there are issues that they need to have addressed with regard to the safety and sanitation of their units. And so that is just another way that we are going to partner with that legislation to make sure we are holding landlords accountable for providing the appropriate information to our tenants so they know who they can reach out to for issues concerning their life and safety.
Thank you so much. With that, I will turn the podium over to Senior Policy Advisor Andrew Dyer.
Thank you, Chair Favor, Councilmember Bankston. So the two initiatives that we will be talking about this evening are third-party payment and pay to stay. And realistically, we see these two pieces working together. So one of which will be working with the landlord and the tenant before the breach of contract, and then the other will be working all the way up to the eviction hearing. So third-party payment would require that a landlord would accept payment on behalf of a tenant if the tenant is not in breach or default of their rental agreement. Failure to accept the payment would be deemed as an affirmative defense in any eviction action filed against the tenant. And in both of these, we'll just add the caveat that third-party payment does not prohibit landlords from evicting tenants for reasons other than non-payment of rent. So third-party payment is not a defense for other reasons for eviction outside of non-payment of rent. In layman's terms, an example of that would be a tenant's car breaks down a week before the rent is due, so causing that financial hardship that we often see. The tenant knows that they will be short on their rent, so they immediately call the organization who has emergency rental assistance available. If they can provide a confirmation letter that rental assistance is on its way and will be available before the breach of contract, which will make the landlord whole and keep the tenant in their unit. If the landlord were to refuse to accept this payment, even though it was secured before the breach of the rental agreement, this would be a violation of third-party payment. Pay to stay is what we talk about as the second piece, so all the way up to the eviction hearing. So Ohio is one of only 5 states that allows landlords to evict a tenant if they pay rent just a 1 day late or $1 short. So we understand, given the many negative consequences to evicted tenants and the impact on public services, local governments have started to pass pay to stay ordinances, especially during the pandemic, some of which had sunset provisions, others have remained in existence. That would give the tenant a reasonable chance to pay back their rent and remain in the homes. And just a few examples, so many of the communities, especially these in greater Columbus region, we're obviously facing a severe housing shortage. We have a housing crisis and high housing cost inflation. So eviction prevention strategies like pay to stay and third-party payment preserve those leases and existing affordability and are just one tool that are designed to address the affordability challenge. So pay to stay, as legislated in other municipalities, they provide tenants a defense to an eviction for non-payment of rent if the tenant tenders to the landlord and the landlord refuses to accept all past due rent and reasonable late fees. So the tender can either be prior to the eviction being filed or after the eviction filed, but before the court issues a judgment. And again, pay to stay does not prohibit landlords from evicting tenants for reasons other than non-payment. Under pay to stay rules, a landlord is made whole for all lost rent and expenses. And in fact, landlords can save money by avoiding legal fees and costs associated with then re-renting the property following an eviction. And some of the municipalities in Ohio that have pay to stay legislation, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Toledo, Dayton, Akron, Reynoldsburg, and South Euclid. There are others that had it during the pandemic that had sunset provisions, or it ended on the emergency order. All of these on this list remain today. Moving on to pay to stay as a potential ordinance that Cleveland passed in 2022. So looking at this as one example. And again, tenants facing an eviction for non-payment of rent are given the chance to pay their rent, late fees, and court costs by the time of the hearing. The ordinance limits the amount of late fees that landlords are allowed to charge. So they may not exceed $25 or 5%, whichever is larger. And then finally, pay to stay would protect renters who are waiting for funds to come through the ERA. So letters showing that payment is approved but still being processed will be accepted. And again, understand that this is Cleveland's legislation. This is not our proposed legislation. This is a city in the state of Ohio that currently has it. And again, pay to stay does not prohibit landlords from evicting tenants for reasons other than non-payment. So an example like the third-party payment of pay to stay, single mother with 2 children have to take off work because of an illness at the daycare. So this mother knows that that financial emergency will cause her to be short on rent. She is given the eviction notice after the breach of her contract and then immediately looks for rental assistance dollars. A week before the eviction hearing, she receives confirmation and has those dollars in hand for that rent and the reasonable late fees. If the landlord chooses to refuse that payment, this would be a violation of pay to stay and an affirmative defense to any action that was filed by the landlord against the tenant only for non-payment of rent. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dyer, for that the presentation. I'm going to direct the first 2 questions to Chief Counsel Laura Baker-Morrish, just because there were some legal terms that were tossed out there, and would just want to ensure that everyone's operating under the same level of information. We heard breach of contract, and we also heard affirmative defense. Would it be possible for you just to give us a layman's explanation of what those terms mean?
Sure. Breach of contract just means that the 2 parties had agreed to specific terms, and one of the parties, in this case, the tenant, has violated one of the terms of that agreement. So, for instance, a landlord says, I'm going to rent you this property for $800 a month. You're going to pay it by the first of the month. The tenant doesn't pay by the first of the month, and that was a specific term in the contract. That tenant is then in breach of that contract. So it just means you violated your contract. The revised code then provides for the landlord to have the ability to enforce that contract. And so when you have that written agreement and there is breach, then that means that there is then potential legal action that can be taken. In terms of an affirmative defense, that's where that comes into play. In the event that there is legal action taken, an affirmative defense would be a defense that has to be proved by the individual who is claiming the defense, which means that in this case, that affirmative defense would have to be proven by the tenant. And that defense would have to be, in the case of pay to stay, that I proffered the back due rent and any reasonable late fees, and the landlord refused to accept it. So that they would then carry the burden of proof during the court hearing of proving those things happened.
Thank you. And just to clarify that, and this could be to Chief Counsel or to Andrew, we are only talking about the non-payment of rent as a term of what could be a breach of contract that we are trying to resolve here. We're not talking about any other type of breach, which could be a criminal activity.
Criminal
or-
activity or destruction of property.
Correct.
Or having somebody who stay with you who's not on the lease, those kinds of things. Any other term that you might have in a contract that could be violated would not be impacted by this legislation.
And I think it's important for us to just reiterate that, because we definitely don't want landlords to believe that we are trying to perpetuate any type of landlord-tenant relationship that would run contrary to what we hold as a value here. criminal activity, domestic violence, things of that nature, whatever you all have agreed to in that contract, that's not what we're trying to meddle with. What we're talking about is something as substantive as just not having the money to pay your rent, and that is it. That's correct? Okay. Andrew, what is the difference, the main difference between third-party payment and pay-to-stay?
The main difference is third-party payment is breach of contract. So as Laura mentioned, the breach of contract. So if you have, this money needs to be by X number of date per the contract. The first minute, the first date that you are outside of that, you are in breach of contract, and so third-party payment would not be allowed to be made anymore. Pay to stay is all the way up to the eviction hearing. So from the point that you're not going to have the rental assistance or the money to be able to afford the rent for that month, all the way up to that hearing date that an eviction judgment would be made, you would have the ability to receive that rental assistance, and give that to the landlord, including the late fees.
And so for that reason, is that why it's important to have both third-party payment and pay-to-stay legislation on the books?
Yes, I mean, in my opinion, yes. I think they work in tandem together to allow for that additional time. Third-party payment is, if you're in breach of your contract, you're in breach of your contract. So if you can get it beforehand, that's the benefit. But what pay-to-stay allows is the tenant to have that additional time to secure that rental assistance so that they can make the landlord whole and they can stay in that unit, in that safe and sanitary unit.
Do we have an idea, in the presentation, I believe the language for pay-to-stay is prior to an eviction being filed or after an eviction is filed, but before the court issues a judgment. Do we have an idea what that time frame looks like?
Generally, what we see is about 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks after the eviction has been filed before the court date would be scheduled. Again, that depends a lot on the impact over the last couple of years with the pandemic. Timelines were a little bit skewed, a little bit longer because of that, shorter because of the lower number of evictions. But in the last month or two, there have been an increase in the number of evictions, and so we've seen that a little bit longer. But generally, a good estimate is about 3 weeks between filing.
In your opinion, how does this benefit landlords or the property owners?
Well, we often hear that, and we understand that when you evict a tenant, you are not generating income. That tenant leaves the unit, you may have to turn it around, you may have to fix some things after it's over, put a fresh coat of paint on, and then put it up for rent. And so that period of time where you're not generating revenue, if you can have those rental assistance dollars go to make the landlord whole as far as the rental payment and any late fees that were in the rental contract, then the tenant gets to remain in that unit and the landlord is made whole in addition to those late fees, and they don't have to worry about re-renting or turning that unit over.
Have we learned anything from other cities that have put pay-to-stay in place? And I don't think you mentioned any cities that have a third-party payment option, but if there are lessons learned from that legislation as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it made a difference during the pandemic. I think Gahanna, for example, I believe either just passed or is in the process of passing both third-party and pay-to-stay. We wouldn't know the impact of that itself, but we do know that the impact is great when we have rental assistance dollars. If we didn't have those assistance dollars, these two pieces of legislation would be a lot weaker from a sense of if we don't have the money for the rental assistance, then they wouldn't be able to get that from that organization.
So digging a little bit deeper into third-party payment and how it would actually work, I think in the example we talked about, there was an organization that submitted a letter that said that payment would be remitted on behalf of the tenant who was in breach. What if someone's friend was able to get them money? Would that count in this instance?
Yes, that would count as long as they had the full payment allotted. And it was, so again, in the Cleveland scenario, they have an opportunity for you to provide a confirmation letter that the money is on the way. Other cities have not done that. Other cities have chosen to move in a direction of that money needs to be in the hand of or in the bank account of that landlord by the time you would be in breach or by the time you would have an eviction judgment. So depending on the route that you would go, in either scenario, the friend, if they had that exact amount of of money available and we're able to give it to the landlord in time, then that would be an acceptable payment.
Okay. And I would imagine in that example, there'd have to be some type of proof provided that that friend had the money in the account, correct?
Yes, again,
Otherwise,
if you
anyone
wanted to
could
do
just
that.
write a letter.
Yeah, or if you needed it in hand, then they would actually have to provide a check or cash in order to, and then if they had cash, they would have to be provided a rental receipt.
Okay. Councilmember Bankston, any questions for Mr. Dyer?
I guess, and this may be for Chief Counsel, what about the scenario, and I know that once you are past your lease term in Ohio, it automatically goes to month, so when we're talking about breach of contract, would that be that month to month, or would it just be that original lease and the agreement that was signed with that original lease?
Thank you, Councilmember Bankston. I believe as written, the original terms of the lease will continue in a month-to-month fashion, so you'd be in breach if you failed to pay when you were then due, as in the terms under the original lease. So if your lease was already due on the 15th, and then you were extended month-to-month, you would be in breach on the 16th.
Got it. And again, thinking about this, right, I think twofold, right? We want to think about the emergency situation, how we're keeping folks in their homes. Have we thought about further upstream after, say, this has been enforced and they're able to stay? Is there any recourse or anything that we're thinking of that would prevent eviction in the future for any type of reason, or say the landlord just doesn't want that person in their unit anymore? Have we thought about what that looks like when that person gets to the end of their lease and they've either accepted third-party dollars, whether it be city dollars or what have you, or is that not necessarily tied to this piece of legislation? And that's a curveball question.
No, it's a really good question. I mean, we have thought about it, but we don't have anything substantive for it. You know, it's like some of these issues that we have, we're kind of putting Band-Aids on what the bigger issue is, which is housing costs and wages of individuals that live in Columbus. So I think that's a larger issue. That's a really good question. It's something that we've thought about, but we do not have anything substantive, at least from the research side of things at this point.
Got it. And then I think with the pay-to-stay portion of it, and someone gets their rent paid before they get to, say, eviction court. What happens to that eviction? Is it still on their record, or does it come off, or does this type of legislation help alleviate that at all? Because I think maybe we may fix that, again, emergency situation, but when that person goes to rent down the line, if they have an eviction on their record, we know how much harder it is for them to attain housing.
So the good news of that would be an eviction judgment is another level, right? So if an eviction filed, it stays on a FABCO for 8 years, and there are ramifications for that. Actually, having an eviction judgment is a much harder issue than when you go to re-rent. You wouldn't have the judgment. My understanding is from a municipal perspective, we have to work with the courts in order to have some type of expungement or anything like that to have it off of your record. Again, that's my understanding.
In other cities, and I don't know, probably have the exact number, but what's the utilization of this kind of legislation? I mean, is this something that we're seeing quite frequently in other cities? Have we seen, I think, landlords come around to embracing it? I'm not sure if we have any hard data around it, or if there's any qualitative that you have all gathered during your research.
No quantitative data. We've talked to partners like Legal Aid and folks at Eviction Court. I mean, obviously, pay to stay would be utilized more and is utilized more than third-party payment because it's a lot harder to secure emergency rental assistance pre the contract breach, but we don't have quantitative data at this point on that.
Thank you.
All right. If there are no further questions, We will move forward with the public testimony portion of tonight's hearing. We do have 9 speakers that will be providing testimony this evening. If this is your first time here, I will call your name, and you can please state your name and any organization that you might miss. There will be 3 minutes that will start, and after the 3 minutes concludes, there will be a light ding to remind you that your time has come to an end. With that, we will move forward with our first guest this evening, Carly Booz. Welcome back to council. No, it's all right.
Good evening, Chair Favor, Member Bankston. My name is Carly Bose. The Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio thanks you for hosting.
Try again.
How's this?
Yeah.
Once again, I want to thank you for hosting this important discussion to identify emerging housing gaps in our community and the unique local solutions that can close them. As our community grows, we know that expanding our affordable housing inventory is of utmost importance. From recent housing bond investments to the opportunity to invest local Fiscal Recovery Act funds into our long-term housing infrastructure, AHCO is optimistic that we are approaching that need with creativity and urgency. Under the strong and visioned leadership of this council and Mayor Ginther, I am confident that we can be the first community in the country to solve this challenge. Yet, we know that housing cannot be built overnight. And we must respond to short-term displacement pressures through impactful and narrowly targeted legislative tools like pay-to-stay and third-party pay, which strike a balance between the legitimate business interests of owners and the wrecking ball of consequences that follow an eviction for both families and the communities in which they live. As you know, Ohio is one of the few remaining $1 one-day states, meaning that a tenant can be evicted for minor, time-limited, and importantly, curable lease violations. With local rents rising exponentially and Central Ohio flooded by out-of-state property investors, we are witnessing an increase in these avoidable evictions in which some landlords refuse cash-in-hand offers that would make them whole. This legal dynamic is in stark contrast to the existing rights of homeowners who have long been afforded the ability to cure mortgage delinquencies to avoid a foreclosure. Local nonprofits on the front lines of the eviction fight report increases in landlord refusal to accept reinstatement funds. Some also report new lease terms that explicitly prohibit churches and nonprofits from helping their constituents in need. This is particularly concerning as evictions hit all-time highs, having already broken records set during the Great Recession. Through April, Franklin County eviction filings were 35% higher than at the pre-pandemic rate, and the eviction prevention hub, Rentful 614, received over 7,000 visitors in just the last 30 days. It is impossible to adequately underscore the lasting repercussions evictions have. Evictions are linked to food insecurity, to poor physical and mental health, to lower testing scores and graduation rates in youth, and increased layoff risk for workers. Moreover, using a model developed by the Arizona University College of Law, AHCO estimates that evictions cost Franklin County over $124 million each year in additional shelter expenses, hospitalization costs, foster care needs, and other youth interventions. Thankfully, pay-to-stay is a proven tool that is already active across our state, now protecting approximately 1 in 8 Ohio renters. It works by codifying an existing common law defense to eviction, providing predictability and consistency in the application of our laws. In many jurisdictions, it was passed with broad housing industry support, including in Cincinnati, where it was advanced by a joint effort of the local apartment association and legal aid attorneys. Today, may I continue? Thank you, ma'am. Today, Alexandria Alvarado of the American Apartment Owners Association said this specific Columbus proposal can buy us time, I quote, to connect the supply and demand imbalances in Columbus. Once again, the Alliance thanks you for hosting tonight's dialogue. I am happy to answer any questions you may have regarding the end of preventable evictions in our community.
Councilmember Bankston, any questions?
Could you just state that number again of how much we're losing from evictions? I think you said a dollar amount that as a county that we're losing out on, or that as a deficit due to evictions. Could you just state that number again?
Yeah, it's $124 million, and I should note that that is only a very specific fraction of the cost that we incur. It's hospital usage. Pardon me, let me reference this so I can be specific. shelter expenses, hospitalization costs, foster care costs, and other youth interventions.
Got it. Thank you.
So it is incredibly important to call out the advocacy of the Alliance, the Affordable Housing Alliance. You all brought this idea to council back when the pandemic was really roaring in 2020. And so we appreciate your advocacy over the years, not just on this specific piece of legislation, but continuing to keep us well informed about what the everyday experience of our residents who are particularly vulnerable, housing insecure, vulnerable, and other types of vulnerabilities. I would ask, and I hate to put you on the spot here, but prior to the pandemic, we were also facing an eviction crisis. Does the eviction crisis still exist as it is today?
Yes.
Yes.
And it is growing worse.
And are we still the #1 county in the state of Ohio with the highest rate of eviction filings?
I believe so, ma'am, and I believe that it is also growing the fastest.
And so, the case being presented that we're trying to mitigate one problem and also address another. That if we do in fact have a housing crisis, and we do, I believe the number was at one point 54,000 units short, but I don't think that it includes what has come from the pandemic. So if we're 54,000 units short before the pandemic, and we were already the highest county in the state of Ohio with evictions, that if we don't have enough housing units right now to take care of folks who are currently in our community, what are we going to do if we continue on the same track record for evictions in the county as well?
If I may, I need to recognize the leadership of Mayor Ginther, your body, and the county commissioners, because we did start at 54,000. But from 2017 to 2019, we had remarkable progress, and we had dropped that number about 10%.
Good.
Then COVID hit. And we're waiting to see what that data says now. I think we all have assumptions about where it's moving, but I got to reference what Hannah said, and that using these ERA funds is a unique opportunity, not just to help those short-term needs, but to build that long-term infrastructure. One of the newer considerations we have, though, is not to be able to throw up new roadblocks to the distribution of those ERA dollars. Wouldn't only aggravate evictions, but now would impede our ability to access those long-term funds that we know so many groups, I see the Ohio Realtors here, many others in our community have advocated for.
Wonderful. Thank you for your testimony this evening.
Thank you, ma'am.
Director Jones, I apologize, I should have pointed to you, but your office has been laser focused on addressing the housing crisis in partnership with our Director of Housing Strategies, Ms. Erin Prosser. I don't know if you would offer up anything else, just based upon the dialogue.
Sure, I would just build upon what you were saying, which is that we have continued to build at a deficit. We have done 8,000 to 11,000 units per year versus the 20,000 we need to be at. But we also know that supply isn't 100% the answer. So it is about really preserving affordability where it is and where it exists, continuing to increase the supply, and then look at all the interventions that help keep people in places where they can thrive, helps us continue to have mixed income opportunities and not to necessarily cause more reasons for us to have a more acute crisis than we already do.
Right. Thank you. And it is also the acknowledgement that this is only one part of the conversation, that the other part of this is ensuring that we have good paying jobs in our community so that folks can pay for the housing that is already currently available, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time, and we could talk about the crisis that revolves around our housing and evictions and, quite frankly, our unhoused space, while also acknowledging that we have to continue fighting for and bringing in good paying jobs into our community. Next, we have Grant Ames, who is no stranger to council. Welcome back, sir.
You are very right. It is weird standing up here. And I have a new appreciation for the 3 minutes that I never had before. kind of feel bad for all the people over the years that I said, nope, you're done, no, enough time. But thank you so much for having me, and thanks for hosting this evening. My name is Grant Ames. I serve as the Government and Relations Manager for the Central Ohio Area Agency on Aging. COAAA plans, funds, and delivers services for older adults and people with disabilities so that they can remain safe and independent in their homes. Our mission is to inform and support people as they navigate the experience of aging and disability. I'm here today to express COAAA's support for the proposed ordinances and to highlight the desperate need to protect older adults from preventable evictions. Older adults are more susceptible to losing their housing than ever before. 27% of Columbus residents over the age of 60 are renting, and of those, 64% are housing cost burdened, meaning they spend over 30% of their income on housing. As housing costs rise, older adults are on a fixed income are forced to make difficult decisions between paying rent, being able to afford food, visiting family members, paying for medications, and healthcare costs. Furthermore, the experience of eviction, as Carly mentioned, has been directly tied to health. Older adults who experience eviction are more than twice as likely to have poor health and die prematurely than those who don't. The clients served by COAAA require in-home services like caregiving and home-delivered meals to remain healthy and independent. These vital services rely on stable living conditions to be successful. If our clients lose housing, they could face hospitalization, institutionalization, or even worse. Protecting older adults' ability to age at home is fundamental to their routines that support health and their well-being. In 2019, COAAA, with funding from City Council, developed our housing assistance program to try to get ahead of some of the issues that we were facing with the folks that we serve. Since then, we've served about 540 folks, which is really incredible, and our case managers work directly with individuals to provide some additional assistance and coaching along the way to make sure that that rental assistance isn't the only thing that they're receiving in services and support. Most of the folks that we're serving are women, people of color, and have a monthly income below $900 a month. We're seeing that this housing crisis and the reliance on emergency funds has absolutely been helpful to the communities that we're serving, but the demand is always higher than the assistance and resources that we have available. Administering the HAP program, our case managers frequently encounter the situations that we're discussing today. Property managers unwilling to acknowledge late payments or those submitted by a third party, significantly limiting folks' ability to pay their rent on time and have access to services and resources that they desperately need. I have plenty of examples, and I'm happy to follow up with some written testimony so that you have those as well. But for older adults and people with disabilities, stable housing is essential to maintaining their health, safety, and quality of life. The legislation you're proposing tonight affords necessary protections for the most vulnerable in our community, and I applaud Council's efforts to continue to address the eviction crisis. COAAA looks forward to our continued partnership in supporting older adult residents' ability to age in their homes and communities with dignity, autonomy, and respect. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ames. Great job. Councilmember Bankston, anything on you?
No questions. I just want to make sure that I lift up the work of COAAA, and particularly, I think, our senior population. A lot of times we focus on families in this conversation because those are the ones that I think are being impacted the most, and we want to always think about children and families, but our seniors in particular get left out of the conversation a lot of times. And one of the things that you said that is so sobering is that many of them, if not the pure majority of them, are on a fixed income, right? And whether that be a pension or retirement or Social Security, those increases, those cost of living adjustments don't typically keep up with inflation. So this is a vulnerable population that in many cases doesn't even have the ability to go out and make additional income to meet that housing burden that continues to go up. So thank you all. I just want to make sure I lift that up and underscore our senior population that sometimes is just left out of this conversation. So thank you for what you're doing every day over there at COAAA. And if you're ready to come back, we still got some space.
Well, thank you for that. I know my former boss is still here and keeping his seat warm. So I appreciate you all and thank you again for the conversation.
Absolutely. And I think, Councilmember Bankston is spot on. The reality is that housing insecurity is not felt equally across our community, that when you really do dig deeper into the numbers, that our Black and brown residents with disabilities, and our seniors are most vulnerable to face housing insecurity. And so we always have to introduce equity into the conversation. And I believe that this is one way to ensure that we're acknowledging that very fact. So thank you for your advocacy this evening. Next. Oh, testing. Okay. Next, we have another amazing advocate for housing as well as landlords, Ms. Anna Marie Perales-Lang. Welcome back to council.
Good evening, Councilwoman Favor and Councilwoman Blackston. I know that I'm the opposite side, but I actually think these two things that you're trying to introduce are good things. I just want you to remember, because I didn't hear anybody mention it when you were saying you're for the residents as a community, that you're also needing to remember that you're also here for the landlords, because we also pay taxes. And we are a business. We are the only business that gets crucified for wanting to be paid. You cannot do this to a mortgage company, which you really should, okay, or a finance company who's taking back a vehicle. So, but we're fair game. So I applaud that what you're doing, and I know that you're basing it on a lot of people that don't do their job the way we do, which is try to do it right. And I just wanted to share a couple little things. This is my delinquency for today for one of my properties, is on the east side. I have $32,000 still open, and this is not late charge. This is just rent. I have 5 people who we have not been able to contact, meaning we have gone to their house, we have called them, we have left messages over the weekend, we have put notes on their door in the evening, and yet these 5 people have yet to even acknowledge that they owe the rent or anything, okay? I have 4 people that we are waiting on help from, that somebody is going to be helping them, but we haven't received it or anything. And then I have a couple of people, most of the people are people who have made arrangements till the end of May. So I think as a landlord, we really try to keep our residents. It is very costly to go to eviction court. And one of the things that I wanted to address is when you are speaking about pay to stay, keep in mind that it's not just the rents. First of all, the breach of the contract is automatically, yes, when you're late on your rent, that is a breach. But remember that we also have, because we're an apartment community, that you address that, we also have to pay a lawyer. So if we allow you to stay, and we do make, now the courts have you speak to a mediator and you come up with an agreement, and that's great. However, we still have to have our court fees paid, because we wouldn't have been going to court if this didn't happen. And not only that, I can't give my employees 401ks, because I have 32,000 people that on May the 17th have still not paid me the rent that was due on May 1st, late May 2nd. And I think as a landlord who has been trying very hard to work with the city, with everything, keep in mind that as far as the other one where you want to have a third party pay, that is an excellent, except for you need to put on there the time limit that it's going to take them to pay us. Because when the pandemic, Impact owed me at one time $30,000 for people that I did not get for 6 months. Now that is $30,000 of my income. And I still had to pay the bills, I still had to pay the employees, I still had to take care of the residents. So I don't want to, okay. But I just want to say, it's a great idea. I think you're in the right, I think it's going the right way. I know that that's not how you think I see it, but I do. I just think that when you are making these things, you need to consider that it's not all huge apartment complexes. It's a lot of smaller ones, and this is our business. And we cannot survive if we are losing this kind of money all the time. We will work with whoever, but make it in there that you have You have to have it by 45 days tops, you know, not 7 months later, that you have to cover all the rent, like you said, and that it has to be, and can't be a check because it could bounce. Has to be a real person that's paying, okay? Those are the things that we encounter. So I think like what you're trying to do is great, but I think that you really also need to consider that you also represent the landlord. We are a business, and we are trying to be able to prosper too, because if I prosper, the residents prosper. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for your testimony this evening. And, you know, I know personally I am intentional about acknowledging that we cannot resolve our housing crisis without our landlords being an active participant in this process. You all are small business owners, and that is why we are talking about ensuring that we're making you whole. And I know that sometimes that message might feel like it's getting lost in the sauce, but I'm going to reiterate once again that we absolutely recognize that you all are part of this process, and we can't do it without you. I will also, you know, once again tell you thank you for the way in which you worked with the city over the last 3 years as our emergency rental assistance program has evolved over the years. And now I'm going to turn it over to Director Jones because I know she's got some good stuff there.
Sorry, I feel like I'm in school. Please, sorry. I wanted to acknowledge that we have heard that feedback loud and clear, both from years of growing, but also with this additional funding and opportunity to really streamline that work. So our team spent some time last year piloting an effort with some of the biggest eviction filers in the county to look at ways to make payments more timely in an effort to be able to engage with folks, to keep evictions from being filed, but also, as you're saying, to acknowledge that this is about making our landlords whole and continuing to have people in our community who are providing housing units that are available to our residents. So what we will be bringing before you is a very streamlined effort for this next $25 million. It will have one provider who does the application intake, and it will have one provider who executes the checks. And that is based on their experience in this pilot. They were able under the pilot to get 700 checks issued in 2 weeks. So I want to be sure that, piggybacking on what you're saying, Councilmember, that we're hearing that, we're acknowledging it, and we're hoping that what we are rolling out is much more efficient and meets the needs of all parties who are part of this.
Thank you for that. And, you know, I already acknowledged the two public hearings that we just held over the past 2 weeks that kind of delve a little bit deeper. But I'm going to give the Department of Development a round of applause, as well as our partner agencies across the county, because it truly was a Herculean effort. Don't talk about me, guys. To get close to $70 million, $80 million out the door, so much so that we have demonstrated good stewards of the funding, that we have received more funding from the federal and the state. And so you all have taken that feedback. We appreciate our landlords that have provided that feedback, that have held us accountable. And because of that, the program has evolved into a new form that we believe is going to meet the demand of ensuring that folks get the dollars that they need, but ensuring that our landlords are paid on time as well. Councilmember Bankston, I know as chair of small business, this is a particularly important area for you as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said it when I was mentioning my remarks about the rental registry, that this is both about tenants and landlords and housing providers, because, again, it's not just simply, we're not asking folks to forego anything. What we're asking for is that we're going to put mechanisms in place. This is one piece of this sweeping legislation that Councilmember Favor has tasked us with leading. They all work hand in hand and work tandem. And I think that it's always bad governance to just mandate things without putting mechanisms in place to be helpful. And so that is what we're trying to do. So I would encourage folks that are here, that are listening, and I would ask you, Ms. Anna Marie, because you're one of our stellar landlords and companies here in the city, to encourage other folks to get involved. We need their voice. We want to hear from them. This is not about demonizing or punishing landlords. We, as a city, have failed you in that our affordable housing crisis is directly related to our plan was to rely on the benevolence of landlords and not have any policies or incentives in place to keep folks housed. So now we're doing that, and I want to thank our housing chair because under her leadership since taking this, she has hit the ground running and has come up with sweeping legislation. And I know that we have a housing division and a division in our economic development department under Hannah Jones who is willing to work hand in hand because this is both about strengthening our economy by making sure that folks are stable. Because when folks are stable in their homes, they can go to work. When folks are stable in their homes, you're going to get your rent check, right? And that is what this is all about. It is about ensuring that we are keeping folks stably housed so that they can go out and take advantage of the opportunities in this city. We are blessed in that we are the fastest growing city, that we continue to hit all these benchmarks, but what good does it do if the people who live in the city aren't able to access it? And I've seen firsthand with my work in my day job what losing your housing can do and the domino effect that happens. So just want to be clear, this is not about demonizing our landlords. We need them in the conversation. If you sit on the sidelines and think that we've already made our minds up, then your voice and your advocacy won't be heard. But if you continue to show up and you continue to take us at our word and engage with us, we will come up with a piece of legislation that not everyone's going to be happy with. Y'all know my philosophy. Everyone's invited to the table. That don't mean that we're going to agree when we walk away. But everyone's voice needs to be there. So I just want to make sure I underscore that through this whole entire process. Please show up. We are listening. We want the feedback so that we can make legislation that is meaningful, that's impactful, but that works when it hits the ground.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Bankston. Chief Counsel.
Thank you, Chair Favor. I wanted to address a comment that was made regarding third-party payer and just offer a clarification about how that works hand in hand with pay to stay. I think Mr. Dyer mentioned this in his initial remarks, and I think Councilmember Bankston just talked about how these all work hand in hand. So the third-party payer provision does not give the third party a longer period of time to pay the rent. That is just requiring that if you have a third person who is coming along to pay the rent on behalf of somebody else, that it needs to be accepted by the landlord. As an example, I have a son who lives on campus. I pay his rent. And that would require that the landlord accept that money. If you are in breach, if you've gone beyond when it's actually due, that's when pay to stay would then kick in.
That's a great call out, Chief Counsel, because we did see this in action during the height of the pandemic. And as we were working through the program itself, that there were some landlords who did not want to receive payment. Money was good, check was going to clear, but did not want to receive that payment. And so should someone lose their housing unit because someone doesn't want to accept a payment from someone else. So thank you for that call out. Next, we have Isaac Bean. Welcome to council.
All right, good evening. Can you hear me? All right. Thank you so much. Good evening, Chair Favor, Councilmember Bankston. Thank you for holding this hearing and providing me with an opportunity to speak. My name is Isaac Bean. I'm the Director of Social Services at the NSI Food Pantry. I'm here to voice my enthusiastic support for the proposed pay-to-stay legislation we're discussing tonight. Columbus has a phenomenal history within Ohio of serving by example, and we have yet another opportunity to pave a new path forward once again, alongside with some sister cities with pay-to-stay. As it was already mentioned, Ohio is one of only 5 states that still allows landlords to evict families if they pay just 1 day late or $1 short. It is having massive health, economic, and safety ramifications in our community. People experiencing homelessness are 3 to 6 times more likely to have lasting complications with diseases like diabetes, heart disease, and HIV. Evictions are permanently impacting our ability to contribute to our local economy and meaningfully engage with our community. The trauma of homelessness is remembered physically in the body for years after our conditions change. hindering our ability to effectively manage future crises with our full critical thinking faculties intact. That means job security. Homelessness isn't just a problem in the moment, it has lasting effects on individuals, on families, and in the greater community for years after the condition is resolved. The Returning Home Ohio pilot found that our formerly incarcerated neighbors are 10 times more likely to become homeless than the general population. But those who had stable housing were 40% less likely to recidivate. I'll reiterate that. Those with stable housing were 40% less likely to recidivate. If we want to sustainably address the systemic problems of crime in our city, we need to start doing things like this and focusing on how we're supporting people's basic needs every day. Housing affordability is a crisis in Columbus that's affecting every major aspect of our greater community's success. They say $1 in prevention is worth $10 in treatment, and that is true for housing in ways far beyond the dollar amount. Pay to stay is the fiscally, but also the morally and the sustainably correct decision, both for Columbus and for Ohio generally. Please vote in favor of the pay to stay legislation proposed here tonight. Thank you so much for your time, your consideration, having this hearing, and your work on behalf of our neighbors in Columbus.
Thank you for your testimony and your enthusiasm
Thank you.
this evening. And I also want to thank you for elevating our returning citizens. They are also a key population that is particularly vulnerable as it relates to housing. And so I truly do appreciate you acknowledging that when someone does have access to safe and affordable housing, that does reduce recidivism. And as we're looking to continue to provide opportunities for second chances in our community, it's a wonderful way for us to ensure that they continue down a great path and an excellent future. So thank you for your advocacy this evening. Councilmember Bankston, any remarks from you? Thank you, sir.
Thank you both.
Keep that energy up. I need that. Which segues perfectly into our next testimony. The new president and CEO of the Columbus Community Shelter Board, Ms. Shannon Isom. Welcome back to council.
Good evening, Chair Favor, members of the council, and others who I'm joining here. I am Shannon Isom, the President and CEO of the Community Shelter Board, and I would like to represent those that are moving through any levels of destabilization of housing into homelessness. I am thankful that this robust and active council is hosting multiple ways to discuss, to encourage and inform the ways and thoughts and experience and examples of how we're going to think prospectively about solutions to close the gap, this needed closing of the gap within housing, and also important to decrease the flow of those moving into housing instability and homelessness. Therefore, the pay-to-stay legislation, the third-party payments, is an important conversation. Thank you for bringing this forward. We know that over 5,900 evictions are filed in the first quarter of the calendar year of 2023, and that is a 23% increase over last year, a 40% increase over 2009, and we can see that higher numbers of people seeking shelter and evictions are rising more and more, and since the Community Shelter Board has been keeping numbers, homelessness, which is correlated, we believe, also with one of the measures, which is increase in evictions, has been, we've seen more records than any other time in which we've been keeping them. These legislations would allow tenants time to avoid eviction. It would help them seek rental assistance, which we know works so well, and third-party payments, which we know also work well in mitigating the slide into homelessness. These are key renter protections that save dollars in our community. We've seen that the average cost of a family to stay at a shelter and then to get back into stable housing with short-term rent, with our services that's offered and utility assistance, is more than $11,000 per person. Not to mention, which has already been mentioned, the traumatic effects that evictions have on human beings. We also know that children suffer in this. We know this. We know that it's demonstrated through 5 times more likely, those kids who are 5 times more likely to experience homelessness are also children that will experience poor health, continued instability, social determinants of health, but more importantly, the mortality and morbidity of those children go up. We know that. So in saying this, mitigating and seeing this is important. It's important to health education, housing outcomes, and access. And we also know, and I'd be remiss not to say it, these also fall on racial lines and class lines and gender lines. So wholly, this is an important measure. I would be remiss, finally, for the Community Shelter Board not to acknowledge our landlords. They are important to us in the work that we do. They are our friends, our families, they are our community members. Community Shelter Board could not do the work without our landlords. We are currently actively in partnership with 800 of them. That means that, and we believe this, that you are looking at active proposal that not only keeps tenants safe, but our landlords whole, and we know that's important. We then actively ask you to consider that you protect both the tenant and landlords, and also put things in place for if there are bad actors, we have protection for both good landlords and our tenants. The Community Shelter Board, again, thanks you. We thank you for this time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Absolutely. First of all, I just want to say thank you. We are incredibly excited for you to join our community. We are excited about your leadership and vision for the Community Shelter Board, and it's such a timely time for you to arrive in the city of Columbus when we are really grappling with our housing and eviction crisis in Columbus. And I see our unhoused residents as being a critical inflection point that we must wrap our arms around. If we want to be the community that I believe we can be, that this is the time for us to act. And so I'm incredibly excited for you to be here. Councilmember Bankston?
No, I just want to thank you for your leadership. And, you know, really what this is about is preventing folks from getting into our shelter system.
Yes.
Right? It's about how do we get further upstream. So thankful to have a leader in the shelter board that isn't focused on necessarily building more shelters, but figuring out how we can keep folks in their home. And I really love that you lifted this up, and I say this to folks, that this is not simply just about a moral argument. There is a business and economic case that goes with this, and you just laid it out. Over $11,000 we're spending to get folks rehoused. The other opposite end of that number is it costs less than $3,000 on average to keep someone in their home. And the data that we see know that if, in many cases, that's just a one-time payment, and folks are able to keep up and able to grow and continue to do it. They just had that one month of breathing room. So thank you for lifting that up, and thank you for, again, thinking about this, not just from a how do we deal with our unhoused and the pressure it's putting on our shelter system, but how we keep folks in their homes. So thank you for your leadership.
Thank you.
Pay now or pay later, right? That's right. That's right. That's what they tell me about the gym. Right.
That's what they tell you about the gym.
Thank you, Ms.
I
Assam.
appreciate you. Thank you.
Next, we have Melissa Benson. You guys laughed a little too hard on that gym joke. I don't appreciate it. Welcome back to council.
Good evening. My name is Melissa Benson, and I am the Senior Managing Attorney for the Housing Practice Group at the Legal Aid Society of Columbus. Since the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic in March of 2020, LASC has represented more than 6,500 families facing eviction in Franklin County Municipal Court. The concept of pay to stay is not new. in many states, tenants do have the right to get caught up on their rent prior to the granting of an eviction judgment. Several other cities in Ohio have enacted pay-to-stay ordinances locally, and across the country, when someone falls behind on their mortgage or even on their car payment, they are given an opportunity to pay all that they owe, make it right, and move on. Tenants in Columbus deserve these same protections. In my 17 years practicing landlord-tenant law, I have seen thousands upon thousands of families face eviction, most often for non-payment of rent. From time to time, those struggling families would tell me that they had scraped together enough money to get caught up on their rent, that they had borrowed from their friends and their family, that they had gotten an advance from work or borrowed against a retirement fund, and in the past few years, that they have been approved for rental assistance. Each time that they have told me this, I've had to tell them that that might not matter in their case, and it might not save their tenancy, because the state of Ohio has no laws giving tenants a right of redemption when they fall behind in their rent. As has been mentioned several times here this evening, as the law stands, a tenant can be $1 behind in their rent, and they can be evicted. Landlords and property managers can refuse to accept rent when it is even only 1 day late. I have personally seen eviction cases where a family owed less than $100 to the landlord and had that money with them, and the landlord would not accept it, and we were unable to resolve the case, and the tenant had to leave the property. I would like to share a video from August of 2022 from an eviction case in the Franklin County Municipal Court, demonstrating what tenants experience in eviction court when they have gotten the money together to make their rent payment, but the landlord is not willing to take it. I personally observed this hearing and was struck by how hard the magistrate was struggling to prevent a needless eviction. Hopefully the sound works. If we could please.
She's a senior tenant. This is the property manager, so don't shoot the messenger, but, so the owner is not willing to do any sorts of agreements once they're under eviction.
I've never been evicted before. I was only 1 month behind. I only got 2 months behind because they wouldn't accept their financial assistance.
And that is true. The request came through after the eviction was filed and the owner declined the request for it.
But they already was in notification when July 5th, when I couldn't pay my rent, I went to the office and I spoke to Mr. Marco, told him I was behind and that I was getting rental assistance. He said, okay, keep me posted on what's going on. I said, okay. So July 15th, when I got approved for the assistance, I went in office and told him, and he said, they're not going to accept it because it's too late. And then, on the 15th, I got another eviction letter on my door. And then, July 28th, another eviction letter.
We can stop the video there. In case you weren't able to hear very clearly, this tenant testified that she had fallen 1 month behind in her rent and had tried to get caught up, but her landlord wouldn't accept the payment, and then she had fallen 2 months behind. She was approved for rental assistance in July and told her landlord this, and was originally told that they would accept the payment. However, her landlord has a policy that once an eviction is filed, they do not negotiate any sort of settlements, so she was unable to remain in her home. It is important to note in this case that the eviction case was filed in August, and she testified that her rental assistance had been approved at the end of July. Because of this, instead of ERA funds paying a few months of back rent and preserving this lady's tenancy, she had to scramble to move out quickly enough that the judgment against her would be vacated, because the one thing that the magistrate could do in this case was put pressure on the landlord to agree that if she moved out by the time that her red tag was set and the court was set to come and set her out, that they would vacate the judgment against her. But that was all that the court was able to do in a situation where it was clear that the court was compelled by this. This individual had done everything right and was still facing an eviction. So emergency rental assistance in general has been a boon to the Columbus area and has preserved many tenancies and prevented homelessness. A record-breaking 20,897 evictions were filed in Franklin County Municipal Court last year, and only 744 families were set out by the court. This is in and of itself a testament to the power of emergency rental assistance. The Legal Aid Society of Columbus has been working at eviction court for years, and we have seen a drastic change in the way that rental assistance affected our ability to negotiate cases. For example, in 2019, our tenant advocacy project was able to negotiate settlements in approximately 55% of the eviction cases that we handled that year, and in only 35% of those settlements was the tenant able to stay in the home. 2 years later, in 2021, the first year rental assistance was widely available. We were able to negotiate settlements in 67% of the cases that we handled, and nearly half of those, 49%, were settlements that preserved a tenancy. Emergency rental assistance works and saved tenancies. Yet, since ERA was first released, some complexes and management companies have flat out refused to accept rental assistance as a company policy. Others have applied it on a case-by-case basis, taking rental assistance from some tenants but not others, and reasons given have ranged from not wanting to work with a specific tenant to most often not wanting to wait the additional time for ERA dollars to be paid. Occasionally, one property manager at a complex will indicate that they will take rental assistance, and then another one will refuse it, sending tenants confusing and mixed messages. Sometimes the property managers don't have the authority to accept the rental assistance payment that resides higher up. With some regularity, we have seen landlords go through a process of submitting all of the rental assistance documents only to decline rental assistance at the end, again, because of the timing. In these cases, confused and anxious tenants who had a real hope of preserving their tenancy face the uncertainty of homelessness during a housing crisis and often during a pandemic. May I continue? Yes. Rental assistance dollars are incredibly effective in stabilizing tenancies, which in turn stabilizes communities. We face an unprecedented housing crisis in Columbus and Franklin County currently. Evictions are on the rise due to increasing rent, and the need for rental assistance will be greater than ever. The City of Columbus and Franklin County have just received nearly $120 million in additional rental assistance funds from the federal government. In order for those funds to serve their intended purpose, they must be accepted by landlords. The proposed legislation, along with pay to stay, will ensure that landlords get paid and that Columbus families stay housed, which benefits all parts of the community. We thank Council for considering these ordinances. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Ms. Benson. You stated a data point around the number of evictions that were filed last year.
Yes.
And the actual set-outs that occurred. Can you restate that?
Yes, it was nearly 21,000 evictions, 20,897 evictions filed in 2022 in Franklin County Municipal Court, and only 744 families were set out. And for the majority of the year, there are about 9 months of the year, there was easy access to rental assistance. So that was definitely a part of that.
I mean, that is a testament to the work that has been done to really shore up our emergency rental assistance program in the city of Columbus. I mean, that is a phenomenal statistic, quite frankly, that deserves a feather in the cap of all those who have been a part of this solution. Legal Aid continues to be a great partner in this effort at resolving our eviction and housing crisis in the city of Columbus. I'm going to put someone on Front Street here, but Mr. Dyer, we have helped to ensure that the Tenant Advocacy Project continues on with the Legal Aid Society, ensuring that folks have access to counsel, because we know that when a person is represented by an attorney, they are less likely to be evicted from their home. And we are also actively working to prove this concept by studying this effort. Could you talk a little bit about what that looks like and the money that council has invested in ensuring this partnership continues?
So we legislated $1.5 million last year for the eviction program at Legal Aid to do a more robust attorney presence at the court so that they could reach a larger number of individuals that were going through the eviction court process. And then additionally, we legislated $100,000 to Stout, which is a organization that works on economic study and human study of eviction court presence and does a economic analysis and a human analysis on those numbers. And so we're in year one right now. We've secured funding for the second year of 1.5 for that robust eviction court presence. And then we expect some initial numbers at the fourth quarter of 2023.
I am floored that the number was that good in the second year of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. And I know that we could not have done it without the great folks at the Legal Aid Society. And I just want to thank my colleagues for supporting that legislation that continues to support that partnership as well. Councilmember Bankston, anything on your end?
Just really quickly, what is the biggest hindrance that you've seen with landlords who don't either accept the rental assistance, or maybe it's a payment arrangement, maybe I'm coming, like, what is the hurdle there as to why folks aren't willing?
The most common thing that we have been told by opposing counsel or by unrepresented landlords is that they did not want to wait the additional time for the ERA funds to come in. I believe in certain cases they did not want to work with the specific tenants for reasons outside of non-payment of rent. But beyond that, I'm honestly the wrong person to ask, because I see a great benefit in accepting rental assistance as a landlord, and I do believe that in most situations, landlords do that as well.
And this may be a dumb follow-up question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. If you say, I don't want to take that assistance, and say someone's 4 months, 5 months, 6 months behind rent, they just lose 6 months of...
So a landlord always has the opportunity to file a second cause claim, a money claim, against a tenant and attempt to collect that rent. Most landlords in Franklin County do not file that. There's a higher filing fee in our court to file a second cause, I believe in part because landlords were abandoning the second causes and it was causing issues for the court, so they shifted that filing fee. So my recollection is approximately 20% of cases that are filed, eviction cases that are filed, have a money claim in them. They can also file a separate lawsuit to collect that debt or collect it through a debt collector. But if an individual doesn't have the money to pay, they're not going to be able to pay it. And obviously, once someone has moved on, their priority is going to be paying rent at the place that they do live currently.
Yeah, and I just asked that because we were talking about pay to stay. We're putting in things to hopefully get dollars. And if the business case is that, well, we lose money by doing this, but we're trying to make you whole. It seems that you lose more money by evicting people and then having to refill the unit and go through that. And this is not to say that there are all perfect tenants, because they're not. They're also not all perfect landlords. But I'm just trying to reconcile that the business argument is that this would hurt my business, but there's mechanisms we're trying to put in place to not hurt.
Yes, I do think that the new system that the city has come up with for the distribution of the new funds will help to address that. I know that was specifically designed based on those concerns around timing, and I find that very encouraging and hope that it will help to resolve some of those issues.
Yeah. But thank you for what you're doing at the courthouse every day for us.
And the Legal Aid Society of Columbus is thrilled to continue to partner with the City of Columbus, and thanks you for your incredible support on the Tenant Advocacy Project and other issues.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Next, we have Sarah Holsketter. And I feel like I should know how to pronounce it because she is one of our amazing advocates with the Bread Organization by now, but I apologize. Welcome back to council.
Thank you so much, Chair Favor, and thank you to all of our city leaders. For once, I'm here to speak on behalf of the Bread Organization in unilateral, unconditioned support and enthusiastic praise for Councilwoman Favor's initiatives as well as Councilmember Bankston. I'm coming today on behalf of the Bread Organization. We represent 44 congregations in the Columbus area of multiple faith traditions. We want to recognize the diligent, persistent work that y'all have spent over the last several years championing tenant positions and layering this legislation on top of the previous Housing for All legislation. We are so excited about the progress that this makes towards a more equitable system. I have a lot of thoughts about your questions as well, but I'm going to stick to this for time's sake. Currently, if I am behind on my rent, my landlord can take me straight to eviction court and secure a judgment against me even if I have all of the money in hand. Here is a testimony from one of our congregation members. In December 2015, I lost my job at Franklin County Department of Job and Family Services. Since I was living from paycheck to paycheck, I could not pay December's rent by the end of the grace period. On the court date a few weeks later, I had all of the money in my hand, but the property manager would not accept it, and the judge gave me a date by which I had to be out. I would point out as well, I am a social worker. Many of the families that I work with are experiencing evictions. And what I hear from the people I work with is a lot of times it's the DoorDash and the taxes come back in and the settlement from that car crash and them getting a second job. So I'm seeing a lot of families not only who are getting rental assistance, but who are themselves coming up with the money and have it in hand, and the landlord is refusing it. I see that. So just as a pay-to-stay legislation would change this dynamic. We at BRED are so hopeful to see some movement towards making people feel more secure in their homes in circumstances such as this. We're also excited at the opportunity for pay and stay legislation to go a step further and address our out-of-control filings. As Councilmember Bankston said earlier, sometimes we can do things that make sense for us if we only have a mechanism that sort of reinforces it. And so one of the things that we know is that scarlet E of evictions, what I see from the families that I serve is that it's not just an eviction judgment. The filing itself is heavily, heavily discriminated against and can make it almost impossible to find new housing. We are hopeful that the pay-to-stay legislation will be rolled out in such a way as to incentivize and prevent evictions from being filed in the first place. Perhaps, for example, a mechanism saying you have to attest that the person could not show up with all the money before you're able to file. Some other type of prompting mechanism. I also want to shout out to the third-party payment. What I hear from tenants is often that landlords will pick and choose who to accept money from, both agencies as well as individuals. I have seen landlords say, I'd rather not do that. I would rather just kick everybody out and raise the rent. So we are just, again, very grateful for this pay to stay as well as the third-party payments. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. I don't know about you, Councilmember Bankston, but, a sign of approval from BRED wasn't on my bingo card for 2023. So we might want to pay the lottery tonight. No, seriously. Thank you to the BRED organization for your continued advocacy in the housing space. It's incredibly important for us as council and specifically me as the housing chair to make sure that I have regular touch bases with the organization because of the work that you do advocating on behalf of each and every one of our residents every single day. And so the feedback is always well received. Councilmember Bankston, anything from you? Yeah, thank you for being here this evening. Next, we have Shamika Smith. I know. Welcome back to council.
Good evening and greetings to Council President, his absence, to the Chair of the Housing Committee, Councilwoman Favors, to other council members, Councilmember Bankston, the other distinguished presenters and speakers and residents of this great city here today. I'm Shamika Smith, Vice President of Housing Programs for Impact Community Action. I just want to say for the record, we have been a provider that distributes payments on behalf of households to landlords, owners, utility companies, and the Franklin County Auditor, just to name a few. I was just standing in this same space about 2 weeks ago talking about the impact of emergency rental assistance in Columbus, Ohio. I informed this great body that over the last 3 years, Impact has served 40,000 households and distributed over $125 million in rental and utility assistance to help our neighbors avoid eviction and remain stably housed. That equates to over 5,000 landlords. Every day, we still see neighbors who have difficulty with paying rent. We all know too well that costs to maintain housing continue to increase, and there are some neighbors who simply cannot afford to live where they work. We're not talking lots of money here, but we're talking on average $3,500 to keep someone in their home. I'll be the first to tell you that the process has not always been easy, but it can be, and changes have been made to processes to increase efficiency. And sometimes things do not go the way that everyone initially thought. There were landlords and property managers that have partnered with households along the way to prevent evictions. There have been landlords and property managers who wanted to ensure that households were able to maintain housing stability even during the pandemic. There were times when there had to be some serious negotiations to get landlords and property managers to accept the payment on behalf of the household, but it works. There are landlords who have decided, based on whether or not they like the household today, if they want to participate in the program. I've been told by landlords that accepting the payment on behalf of the tenant does not always make a household responsible, but I will argue that any day. The responsible part is someone going to somewhere saying, I need help. Majority of our property owners and landlords have said, yes, I told you, we've made payments to over 5,000 landlords. Yes to being a partner with their tenant. Yes to preventing the eviction. Yes to maintaining housing stability. Yes to encourage other tenants to apply. Yes to keeping families together and safe. What will this mean for a landlord? It is and should be business as usual. Receiving a payment from a third party does not change the agreement with the household. What this will do is ensure and guarantee payment and prevent any hardship to the landlord if the tenant themselves are unable to pay for whatever reason in a particular month or period. This also decreases the additional costs for landlords. Making third-party payment a requirement for landlords and property managers in this city is what's needed. Housing should be available to everyone who chooses this great place to live. Accepting the payment on behalf of the household should not in any way negatively affect their housing stability. Accepting third-party payment creates equity in a system that has been broken forever. I'm here today to declare that rental and utility assistance works. I'm also here to share that payments made on behalf of households provides a landlord and property manager with stability for their business and the community where that property is located. For the record, we understand that landlords are business owners. Our goal is to support the household and the landlord and the property manager. Accepting third-party payment is vital in our city, continuing to be a place where neighbors want to live and work. Thank you, City Council, for your work. As always, Impact Community Action stands ready to serve our neighbors in this great city.
Thank you so much, Ms. Smith, for your testimony this evening. And, as we are applauding partners in the community, Lord knows we could not have been able to do the work that we did without Impact Community Action. Your leadership, as well as Mr. Bo Chilton's leadership, really helped to shore up the foundation of our program. And yes, we had some trip-ups along the way, but that is to be expected. No one ever in our community across the country had to stand up a program the way in which we did and in such a timely way. So thank you for the work that you continue to do, but also I would say more importantly for acknowledging what the process looked like on a provider's end. Someone who for all intents and purposes was a mediator of sorts, so someone that not only remitted payment on behalf of the tenant, but also had to negotiate, work with those landlords, get some buy-in as to the validity of the program, that the money was good, right? And you all did a lot of that work for 2-3 years, still doing it today, but in partnership with the City of Columbus, and so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Councilmember Bankston. Thank you for your testimony this evening. And last but certainly not least is Wade Biglin. Welcome to council.
Testing. Okay. Thank you, Chair Favor, Councilmember Bankston, and everyone else here. We really appreciate this opportunity for the public voice to be heard. My name is Wade Biglin. I'm with NSI Food Pantry, a social services organization that has been providing ERA for the last year. We similarly have seen its growing pains, but there are a couple big gaps that I would just like to point out for the comprehensiveness of this pay-to-stay legislation. I will say I am in full support of the pay-to-stay and third-party enthusiastically. But the two gaps that I see currently, as our current protections are, we have situations where award letters or remittance of payment is provided. In those instances, us as an organization would be liable for those payments. However, the tenant is not protected in those cases yet. Additional fees are still addressed for court, evictions are still filed, and additional late fees are still filed. When those payments are given, by that point, the fees have increased, which leads to an additional problem. The way I see it, if the organization will be liable for those payments, the tenant should be protected in those cases. The second gap that I believe I see, there's discussion that there is no precedence for another type of business where payment is just not given, and the landlord, the opposition to this legislation is certainly welcome to feel that way, but I feel there is a precedent for that. Currently, when utilities for electric or gas are in a household where that person has a medical reason or food safety reason that they cannot have those shut off, the regulations for those utilities companies allows a pledge for 30 days in which they are protected as well. I ask this, if those utilities are vital and essential for our tenants' health, how is their home not just as vitally essential? They can't have those utilities without the home. So I hope our pay-to-stay can be comprehensive enough to address those 2 points, and I thank you so much for making this a very important part of our city today.
Thank you so much for those two call-outs today, and I will point to Mr. Dyer because one key point to note this evening is that we have not provided actual legislation for folks to truly react to, that this part of the engagement process is to test what folks believe or feel about these two proposed ideas in our community. And so when we do think about fees that are associated with the evictions once they have been filed, Mr. Biglin made a point about third party. If a third party is going to be liable to remit the payment, if they have provided that letter stating that they're going to pay on behalf of that tenant, then the tenant should be protected. We haven't talked about any third-party liability there. Mr. Dyer, do you have anything to react to right now, or are we a little too early in the process to say that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that we've looked at. You look at Cleveland as the example where if that third-party provider does have a confirmation that the money is coming and provide some type of date range, in Cleveland, they would allow that as an allowable use. It would not have to be in hand, check in hand. So that is certainly something that would be allowable in some of the cities that have done this. But as far as liability, we have looked at it, but have not obviously decided anything without any proposed legislation.
Thank you for that. And then there was also a call out around utility protections. And so I think those are two valid points, and I appreciate you for raising them this evening.
Thank you.
All right. Councilmember Bankston, any closing remarks on your end?
I just want to reiterate, again, my thanks to your leadership. And I think the gentleman who last speaker really brought this to the forefront is that when we talk about housing, what we're talking about is a human right. Mm-hmm. This is not simply a commodity or simply a business. And so for our folks that are housing providers that want to step into this space, I think that they have to understand what they are providing is something that's essential, that is a human right and something that we, as this council, believe anyway, in this city, that's what it should be. And so again, excited to go through this process. Want to reiterate, this was the first hearing. There's going to be many more. Y'all going to get tired of seeing this. I apologize in advance. But please stay engaged. We want to hear all aspects. And hopefully to folks that are here that are advocates of tenants, have them come down. We want to hear their stories as well. And so, again, just want to encourage folks to stick with the process. And I'm really excited about what this council, what this community, what comes out of these conversations. Because I think that we know that we're going to continue to grow as a city, but we get to choose in this moment how we as a community want to be shaped. And we can do that together. So thank you again for your leadership.
Absolutely. Thank you, Councilmember Bankston. Any remarks, final remarks from our city attorney's office and the Department of Development? Mr. Dyer. All right. Well, I would like to say thank you again to Deputy Director Hannah Jones, Chief Counsel Laura Baker-Morrish, and Andrew Dyer, as well as all of our community members with us here tonight and those that have been with us throughout this process. We appreciate your time as well as the work that has been done to address housing needs in our community. We know housing, and more specifically, affordable housing, is a hot topic of discussion, not only in our city, but across the country. We also know the topic of housing can bring out polarizing opinions. However, simply put, housing is a human right and needs to be treated as such. Safe, stable, and quality housing is critical to the stabilization of families, especially low-income, minority, and Black and brown families, to physical and mental health, quality of life, and economic outcomes, among many others. As I've said many times before, we cannot fix this housing crisis with one policy. We need to be intentional about making changes to our zoning, protecting the affordability we have, and being creative about adding more housing stock in our city. Additionally, it is important to acknowledge the reality of systemic racism, the complex interaction of policies, procedures, laws, and institutions that have created disparities in housing. The reality is that housing insecurity is not evenly distributed across the population. So whether we're talking about evictions, homelessness, or poverty, housing insecurity disproportionately affects people of color, older adults, the disabled, and low-income wage earners. We need to take a holistic, comprehensive approach to understand the needs of our community to properly address the housing crisis. I invite you all to continue to stay engaged with our office, to share your ideas and stay updated on what the city is doing. I would also like to take a moment to remind everyone about Rentful614.com, which serves as the rental assistance hub for tenants and landlords. To learn more about the 2023 Council Housing Initiatives and to stay up to date, please visit www.columbus.gov/2023 Housing Initiatives. Finally, I'd like to thank my staff, Kendra, Tyler, and Sandeepti, as well as our team here at City Hall for helping us with our technology and streaming, and the team here at CTV. Thank you, Councilmember Bankster, for joining us this evening. This will now conclude our hearing. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.